Okay, so we finished wrapping up or talking about photosynthesis and cellular respiration, and so the next two chapters are going to kind of tie in with photosynthesis at least, because we're going to be talking today about plant structure, and also on Monday we'll be discussing transport that occurs between plants. But for today we're going to focus on just kind of a lot of the terminology and just kind of introduce you into plants. And so in lab you'll be doing a whole lot of work with plants as well, so hopefully it'll kind of correlate at least at some point in the semester. So first of all, we're going to talk about all the different kind of structures of a plant. Plants have leaves, they've got stems, they've got roots. So we're going to kind of introduce all of those different concepts and learn kind of the basics associated with each one of those. So when we're talking about plant structure, all plants are going to have roots. All plants are going to have what's called a shoot. You have the roots and the shoots. The roots are below ground, and the shoot is going to be anything that's above ground. And then you're also going to have your leaves, and then some plants will have flowers or fruits that are associated with them as well. And then there's kind of two different kind of plants. There's herbaceous plants, which is like, your grass, your flowers, stuff like that. And then you have your woody plants. These are going to be your trees and other woody type of plants. And so we're going to talk about the differences between the two. We're going to start off looking at herbaceous plants, and then towards the end we're going to focus on the woody plants. And so you can see here's the root system. This is what we call a taproot. A taproot is going to be one main root going down with several little ones branching off. This is all the shoot right here. This is all the above ground part. Here, I guess it looks like a pepper tree. You got a fruit here. You've obviously got your leaves. You've got what's called nodes, and these little nodes are where these new kind of baby leaves pop out and grow out. And then the space in between the nodes is called the internode, because inter means between, so between the nodes. So you got a node there. Basically anywhere where you see a stem or a branch coming off, there's going to be a node right there. And then the space in between them is going to be called the internode. All right, so when we're talking about plant growth, there are several different tissues within the plants that contribute to the growth of a plant. One of them there's a main type of region of actively mitotic tissue that's called the meristems. And there's 3 different meristems on each plant. And again, these meristems are areas of the plant that are constantly dividing, constantly growing, constantly making new cells. And so this division at the meristems is going to contribute to the overall growth of the plant. And so there's 3 different types of meristems. The first one is the apical meristem. Apical means, at the extreme ends. So you actually have 2 apical meristems. You have one down at the bottom of the roots, where the roots are growing and going into the soil. And then you're going to have one at the top of the plant, at the other extreme of the plant, and so that's going to be dividing. So that's what helps as the cells divide and you make more cells. That's what's going to allow the plant to grow up taller. So you've got these apical meristems that are responsible for the longitudinal growth of the plant. You've got one at the very top and then one at the very bottom associated with the roots. And again, all of these meristems are going to have actively dividing cells that are in mitosis. The other type, and by the way, this kind of up and down growth, this is called the primary growth of the plant. Now the lateral meristem is what's called secondary growth. So plants can go up this way and they can also grow out this way. So this is primary growth, and when it's expanding out laterally, this is what we call secondary growth. And so the tissue responsible for, the plant widening, the tree or whatever it is going to be the lateral meristem. And then finally you have the intercalary meristems. These are going to be between those little nodes on those stems, and basically is going to be the region for which a new leaf will grow. So you've got the growth up and down, which is going to be primary. You've got the growth outward, which is secondary. And then the growth of the leaves is going to be guided by the intercalary meristem. But just keep in mind, a meristem is just a region of mitotically dividing cells that are contributing to the growth of the plant in some way. So here you can see where these different meristems are located. Again, the apical meristem, you're going to have one of the, the ends of all of the roots that are going to help it grow downward. And then you're going to have these at the top, which are going to divide and help, move the plant or make the plant taller. And then the apical meristem, this is found all throughout the stem in here. I'm sorry, not the apical. The lateral meristems are found all throughout the stem. So when those cells divide laterally, it's making the plant thicker. And then finally you have these intercalary ones, which are going to be next to the nodes of the plants. And again, these are going to be responsible for making new leaves on the plants. Questions so far? All right, so there's also different types of tissues that are going to be found in plant cells. The ground tissue is what's going to make up the majority of a plant body. And so there's 3 different types of ground tissues and 3 different cell types. The first one is called parenchyma. Now parenchyma is going to be kind of this unspecialized type of cell that's just taking up a lot of the mass of the ground tissue. So if the ground tissue makes up the majority of the plant, it's the parenchyma that makes up the majority of the ground tissue. And so a lot of the overall plant will be made up of these parenchymal cells. The other type, or one other type of cell, is called collenchyma. These guys are going to be living plant cells, and they have these really thick yet elastic cell walls. And so the characteristic of these collenchyma is that they're actually living plant cells. A lot of these parenchyma and sclerenchyma are actually non-living cells, because especially in a tree, as it grows and gets wider and gets bigger, a lot of the cells in there will die off because they don't have as much access to water and nutrients. But these collenchyma, these are going to be the living type of ground tissue cells. And then the other type is called sclerenchyma. And sclerenchyma are going to help support the plant structure as well. They're going to have these very rigid cell walls, and they're going to, again, act as kind of a structural support for a lot of these mature plants. Oh, yeah, sorry.
Is the collenchyma the only cells that is living? So
not in the plant, but of the ground tissues, yeah, the collenchyma is the one that...
So the rest are non-living cells?
Yes,
Oh.
yes. Other questions? Okay, so plants, not necessarily all plants, but a lot of plants have a vasculature system, similar to our vasculature. We have blood vessels and capillaries that, help nutrients and blood and oxygen circulate. Well, some plants have this too. And there's 2 different types of vasculature in plants. There's something that's called the xylem, and then there's something that's called the phloem. The xylem is going to be unidirectional. So in other words, the point of the xylem, so if you can see, imagine this is a stem right here of a plant. You've got your roots in the ground. So what the xylem does is the roots absorb all of these minerals and nutrients and water from the soil, and it's the xylem that helps transport those water and nutrients from the soil upward to the rest of the plant. So this xylem transport that's transporting water and nutrients is only going to be moving upward towards the plant. So from the soil up to the rest of the plants. And then there's something that's called phloem. Phloem is going to be used to transport the sugars that are made in photosynthesis. And so the sugars in photosynthesis are occurring in the leaves. Right? The leaves are where the photosynthesis is happening. And so once you make those sugars, you need to be able to distribute it to the rest of the plant, to all those regions that are not photosynthetic. And so the phloem travels both ways, up and down the plant, to distribute these different sugar molecules that were made as a result of photosynthesis. And each one of these structures have their own specific types of cells associated with them. In the phloem, for example, you have what are called these sieve tubules, and they help transport, they basically act as like a little filter. It's like a little circular thing, and it's got a bunch of holes in it, and so it helps filter the sugars up and down against the plant. And again, the phloem is going to be both going both directions up and down the plant, whereas the xylem is going to be only moving upwards, distributing those water and nutrients upwards to the rest of the plant. All right, so we've already kind of talked about ground tissue and that it makes up most of the plant. There's also what's called dermal tissue. This dermal tissue is basically going to be the outer covering of the plants. Similar to, this is dermal tissue, our outer covering. Well, plants have a dermal tissue too, and it's just called the dermal tissue. And so a lot of plants have what's called a cuticle. And a cuticle, if you've ever seen a leaf that's really shiny and kind of waxy, then that's what you're looking at, the cuticle right there. The cuticle is a way to kind of waterproof the plant. So it keeps water from being dehydrated out of the plant. And that's what makes that kind of thick, waxy, shiny covering that's present on some plants. And so the dermal tissue is going to include this, this waterproofing cuticle that's on the outer portions of the plant. And then we also have the vascular tissues, which is what we were just talking about, the xylem and the phloem. So the three main tissue types in plants are going to be the ground tissue, which is parenchyma, and sclerenchyma. And then you've got the dermal tissue, which is going to include the cuticle. And then finally you've got the vascular tissue, which is going to include the xylem, which is carrying water and nutrients, and then the phloem, which is carrying sugars around.
Can you hold on before I drink it real quick for
Yeah. Questions about anything?
Why do the names of these cells have to sound like bad diseases?
I don't know, but I think sclerenchyma is one of my favorite words. Sclerenchyma, parenchyma. I have no idea where they got those cell names from. Yeah.
So I don't get it. So the parenchyma is the cell tissue?
So there's three tissues, right?
Uh-huh.
You've got the ground, which is going to make up 90% of the plant. And of the ground, you have the sclerenchyma, parenchyma, and collenchyma. And so most of the plant is going to be made up of this sclerenchyma, which is going to be these kind of unspecialized cells that have this thick but rigid kind of outer cell wall. The collenchyma, these are going to be the living guys. But they all make up the ground tissue. It's just that the sclerenchyma makes up most of the ground tissue. So you're not going to find any collenchyma, sclerenchyma, or parenchyma in the vascular tissue or in the dermal tissue. So we're only talking, when you're talking about these three types of cells, you're only talking about the ground tissue. All right? And so of the ground tissue, most of that's going to be sclerenchyma. And the ground tissue is what makes up a majority of the plant.
It's mostly parenchyma.
Mostly parenchyma, my bad. I'm not a botanist. Thank you. Mostly parenchyma. All right, other questions? Okay. All right, so now we're going to kind of move on and start talking about the stems and how they're utilized in the plants. And there's, the stems grow from these apical meristems at the bottom and the top or the tip of the plant. And so most of this stem is going to be made up of this ground tissue. So which means most of the stem is going to be made up of these parenchymal cells. And so a lot in these stems, you'll also see these different, what's called a vascular bundle. If you hear or read about a vascular bundle, all that's talking about, it's literally a little bundle of the xylem and the phloem together. So think of it as kind of like, the blood vessel for the, for the plant. And so these vascular bundles, which, include the xylem and the phloem, are going to be spaced out differently among the stems of these herbaceous plants. And so these vascular bundles, depending on what type of plant it is, are going to appear differently. And so there's two main classifications of plants. You've got monocots and you've got dicots. And so what each one represents is whenever you have a seed, right? And you plant it and you water it and you love it and you grow it. And then once it starts popping up, it's going to have a little baby leaf, right? If it has one of these baby leaves, it's called a monocot. And what the definition of this little leaf is, a cotyledon. And so that's where we get the cot from, is from the cotyledon. So if they have one baby leaf, it's called a monocot. And then if they've got two baby leaves, then that's going to be a dicot. And another word used to describe dicot is called a eudicot. Eu means true, so this is saying it's a true dicot, but it's either one, same thing, dicot or eudicot. And so, and based on whether these plants are going to be monocots or dicots is going to determine, the placement of these vascular bundles within the stem of a plant. And so here, if you look, we're comparing a monocot plant to a dicot. In the top, you can see corn, which is a type of monocot. And so you can see these little vascular bundles. So in these little bundles, you've got xylem and you've got phloem. And so you'll see in these monocots, these vascular bundles will be distributed kind of everywhere within the width of the stem. So when you're looking at this picture, all they did is take a stem, cut it in half, and then you're looking like down into the stem. And so when you do that, you can see all these vascular bundles and all this ground tissue in between. So all of these are going to be those parenchymal cells right here. And so these vascular bundles will be kind of like evenly distributed throughout the stem. Whereas if these dicots, such as a sunflower, instead of being kind of evenly dispersed, they're only going to be around the edge of the stem. So you can see a vascular bundle here. Again, this is just xylem and phloem. Here's another bundle of xylem and phloem. Here's another one, so forth and so on. So you've got lots of these vascular bundles running throughout the course of the stem. In monocots, they're going to be kind of dispersed, and then in the dicots, they're going to be just around the edges. And there's other sorts of differences between monocots and dicots that you need to be aware of. And so here's kind of a little chart summarizing the main differences between the two. All right, we already mentioned that the main definition of a monocot and a dicot is the number of these cotyledons, or these baby leaves. And so these monocots, you can see this is one baby leaf right here, and then here you have, two kind of baby leaves. In addition to that, the number and the pattern of the flowers, if it has flowers, is going to vary. Monocots prefer to have their flowers in multiples of 3 or 4. So, whereas the dicots prefer to have theirs in series of 4s or 5s, or in replicates of 4s and 5s. Also, there's going to be a difference between the roots. We already kind of introduced this notion of a taproot. So it's this one large main root, and then you've got all these little side branches coming off. So that's a taproot. The other type of root is called a fibrous root system. And it's fibrous because it's fibrous. So all the roots, are equal sized and spreading out and, helping to absorb all the water and nutrients from the soil. And so the monocots are going to have this fibrous root, whereas the dicots are going to have this taproot. And then also, we already discussed the vascular bundles. In these monocots, in the stem, you're going to have this kind of little ring of vascular tissue. Whereas in the dicots, you're going to have this other kind of pattern that almost looks like a star pattern with all the vascular bundles right here. So the main differences between the monocots and the dicots are the patterns of their flowers, the type of root system, the arrangement of their vascular bundles, and then whether or not they have one cotyledon or whether they have two cotyledons.
When you say flower parts?
Yeah, like literally.
The petals? Or?
Yeah, the petals. Yeah, so if you see a flower that has 10 petals, it's probably going to be a dicot because it's in multiples of 5. If you see one that has 12, then it's probably going to be a monocot because it's in multiples of 3 or 4.
Are you gonna be able to give us this copy of the slide? It's not.
It's not on there?
It's a few pages down.
Oh, sorry, I moved this, yeah, before class started, I moved this up since we were already talking about monocots and dicots. It's still in there, it's just a couple of slides behind.
Oh, okay.
All right. Yeah, sorry, I forgot to mention that. Okay, so we talked about stems, we've talked about vascular tissue. Now we're gonna talk about leaves. So, like we said, what's so funny back there?
You ignored him.
I didn't hear you, I'm sorry. What'd you ask?
Well,
Oh, I'm sorry.
Why did you move that picture off?
I
The,
found
The
it.
corn slide, right?
yeah, it's after the corn slide.
Okay, I just wanted to move it.
I just grouped it together so it kind of make more sense to talk about it together. All right, any other thoughts or concerns? Are we good? Good? All right.
Wait, I'm sorry. You told me that you talk about multiples of 3 and 4. And
Yeah. So all you're talking about is the patterns of flowers, right? So we have a flower. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. All right, so the monocots are going to have flowers arranged in groups of 3 or 4. And so if you see a leaf that has 3, 6, 9, 12, 15, you know, multiples of 3 or 4, so 0, 4, 8, 12, so forth and so on, then that's going to be a monocot. So this has 9 leaves, so that means if the leaves are in multiples of 3. And so it's not only the number of leaves, it's also the way those leaves are arranged. So you can see here, this is one part of the flower, right? This is one set of petals in a set of 3. And then the second set is